The Department of Government Efficiency, better known as DOGE, has had far-reaching consequences for the nonprofit sector. Many organizations rely on federal funding, regulatory stability, and government partnerships to fulfill their missions. With mass layoffs, budget cuts, and policy shifts under DOGE, nonprofits are facing significant challenges. Join us for an enlightening conversation on the impact of DOGE on nonprofits and how you and your organizations can pivot for success in this current environment. See you on the other side. My name is Valerie Leonard. I am the founder of Nonprofit Utopia. We are an organization that provides capacity building for nonprofit organizations. And given some of the conversations that we've had during our classes, we thought it might be a good idea to come together and hear what one another has to say about their experiences, what they're feeling about what's going on in Washington. We call this the nonprofit fork in the road discussion because, as those of you who've been keeping up may be aware, Elon Musk, who is pretty much in charge in the White House, it seems, typically he tends to take a page from his Twitter days, right? When he took over Twitter, he sent a mass firing memo saying, "You have reached the fork in the road." And he is doing the same thing to some of our governmental employees. But the truth of the matter is, we really are at a fork in the road. We are at a point where our government can go either way. We can continue our rich democracy. And if we're not vigilant, we can go the other way. I have never, ever in my life experienced anything like this. I can only go from what I've read about what happened prior to World War II in Germany, and I'm seeing some dangerous similarities. Not to make this a political discussion, the reality is we're living in dangerous times. And people might wonder, what does nonprofit have to do with this? What can we do as nonprofit leaders and stakeholders and all that good stuff? The answers we may not have at this moment, but I do believe that they rest within all of us. And the fact that nonprofits make up such a large part of our economy means that we cannot let our nonprofits languish. Everybody is going to be impacted one way or another. We have over 2 million nonprofits nationally. And in the state of Illinois, we have over 81,000 and over 1 million employees. The nonprofit sector is about 11% of our economy. And if you live on the West Side, it's about 25% of the economy because a significant number of our employers are nonprofits, if not nonprofits, then government agencies. So when the nation has a cold, we get pneumonia, as they say. So we want to have a conversation today, get a sense from experts as to what they're seeing, what they're experiencing, get some ideas from them. But we also want to take Q&A and get some ideas from people on the ground because ultimately the answers are with us. So we have today Congressman Danny K. Davis. He is a congressman for the 7th Congressional District here in Illinois. We also have Marc J. Lane. He's the president of the law offices of Marc J. Lane. And then we also have Ralph Martire. He's the executive director for the Center for Tax and Budget. So you see, we have a variety of views, of perspectives, just from listening to what people are doing. So without further ado, we're going to get into some of the questions. And my first question for you, Congressman Davis, since this is a national issue that impacts us all, you're on the Ways and Means Committee. And that committee, we know, among other things, is taxed with tax policy. And we're really concerned about what we see DOGE doing, trying to access people's data and all of that good stuff. What is the Ways and Means Committee doing to blunt the effects of what DOGE is doing, trying to take control of government agencies, but particularly the IRS?
The Ways and Means Committee Republicans are doing pretty much whatever Donald Trump and Elon Musk tell them to do, or suggest that's what they ought to be doing. And so the committee, while it's a committee, it is not a committee in unison. But let me say, just as I answer that question, Valerie, let me thank you for your leadership in the non-profit, not-for-profit sector and the tremendous information that you help generate for people. And I'm delighted to be on a forum with this distinguished group of individuals and those who may be listening and calling in. But the Democrats on the Ways and Means Committee are doing everything that we can do to try and protect the kind of country that we have developed after all of these years and several centuries. And it's a good country. It's a sensitive country. It's a country that is embracing all kinds of people from all around the world. It is also a country that allows individuals or provides opportunity for individuals to be born anywhere in any kind of socioeconomic environment and yet feel that they can rise and move upwards and maybe even rise up to the top. And it seems that there are elements in our country who are trying to reduce all of that and change our expectations, change the way we live, and keep the gap between those down here and those up here to be even higher and make the rich or the wealthy wealthier, more influential, more impactful, and more in control of what we do. So you can almost say that we are a nation at war. Fortunately, we're not at the kind of war in terms of physical stuff that's going on, but in terms of ideology, in terms of hope, belief, we are there, and we're going to just have to brace up to it, face up to it, and fight to the finish.
Okay. Are there any specific strategies and actions that you guys are taking, in those meetings? I can just imagine being a fly on the wall during one of those meetings with the Republicans clearly on one side and Democrats on another. Are there any proposals that the Democrats are making that will help rein those?
The proposals are to be fair in what we do and to keep providing opportunities that have become a part of our way of life after all these years and prevent them. Everything that has been accomplished, even from the beginning of the Constitution, the idea that all people were going to be created equal. We know that was not what it really meant at the time, but there was hope in there that the union could be perfected. And so we've been making little bits and pieces of perfecting that union. And here comes a president and his co-president or his assistant president. I don't know what you call him because he's never been elected to anything. He's never been confirmed by anybody, yet he is having tremendous impact on the way our national government is running. And it's hard to imagine how we have allowed that to happen in our democracy with a constitution that separates powers. It's a decent system. It's certainly not what it ought to be, but it's a system that allows checks and balances, and we just don't seem to be able at this particular moment to be checking and balancing as much as we would want to and should be able to. But there's hope. I never give up. I believe that the same two teams play today will play tomorrow. And so we keep preparing and working every day, pushing back. We've had this big information is in the hands of people who shouldn't have it, confidential information that they may be using for whatever. Tax data, for example. This is supposed to be just you and the tax collector and Mark Musk and some of the individuals, young people playing around with that who also express certain ideas about race and ethnicity and never been trained. And it's terrible. So yes, Democrats have a strategy. We are unified. The one thing that we have been pleased about has been the unification of our group, of our party. We are lockstep, pretty much, with our leadership, Hakeem Jeffries and all of his team. So we're hanging in, fighting hard. And the people are catching on, even in Republican districts where the people are pushing back against their representatives and saying, yeah, Congressman, your answer sounds interesting, but it doesn't seem to make a lot of good sense. Hey, yeah, Representative, we understand you. We love you. Yeah, I know your family. I knew your daddy and your granddaddy and all. But what you're saying don't seem to be what even they say. And yes, the movement is on. So we're working.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. And Mark,
Yes, ma'am.
you are such an expert on a number of things: government structures, nonprofit structures, social enterprise. You help write legislation as it relates to nonprofits and hybrid type organizations. You also are expert on taxes in terms of advising your clients. So you have many opportunities to hear from different people, different levels of government, different organizations from all over, probably all over the country or even the world, knowing you. I just want to get a sense for what is it that you're hearing from your nonprofit clients, from your social enterprise clients? Have they been impacted yet?
Valerie, thank you for the question and appreciate being with you and the Congressman and Ralph and all of our friends, old and new. I'm happy to see that the Congressman didn't pull any punches, nor will I, because if we're going to have a serious conversation, it needs to be candid and we need to look at things the way they are. And the reality is we're living in an upside down world. The president, who may have never heard of the term of unitary executive, the philosophy that the president is omnipotent, superior to any other branch of government and accountable to no one. He is in fact putting that philosophy to work in a meaningful and, in my view, chaotic and cruel way. And none of us thrives in an environment of chaos. But in answer to your question, I think the social sector, particularly nonprofits, may be suffering disproportionately. So we have a perfect storm of horribles, and events are overtaking us daily, hourly. But let me just identify a few ways in which I think we're all aware that nonprofits are being disadvantaged and their missions are being subverted. So we know about the prohibition within the government now of programs that advance diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's the hallmark of many nonprofits. That's what they're about. The populations they serve are marginalized populations in disinvested communities in many cases. And then we see spending freezes, USAID being only one of them. We see the possible reincarnation of the House's 9495 bill, which would, this is from last year, but it's resurfacing, and it would see to the withdrawal of tax-exempt status of any nonprofit organization that is alleged to be supporting terrorism. This is code for organizations that are supporting immigrants and migrants. And we have capitulation by the major media, who is now either silent or complicit, and silence is being complicit. Nonprofits are particularly vulnerable because of their dependency on government grants. Government grants to nonprofits, last I looked, was $267 billion. The Urban Institute has reported that all but 2 of the 437 congressional districts, typical nonprofit expenses without its government grants. Here in Illinois, 67% of 990 filers that get government grants would be at risk without them. Then we have charities that are heavily dependent upon government contracts, the object of Mr. Musk's chainsaw. And they're dependent upon philanthropy, also under attack. So it's understandable that nonprofits are operating in fear. They're fearful of donor blowback. They're fearful of government retaliation. So increasingly, they are staying away from lobbying. They're staying away from policy work. They're trying to stay below the radar. Our job, it seems to me, is to help empower them, give them the information, the education they need, and that's reliable, and couple that with design thinking so they can revisit structure, recast mission if necessary, take other steps to preserve them, and do so in a way that is collaborative. So seeing this turn out this evening gives me comfort. And Congressman Davis's optimistic words give me comfort too. But I say we need to have hope. We also need to plan for things that may not go in the better direction, but potentially in a worse direction.
All right, thank you. Ralph, you are a policy wonk, tax and budget wonk, and I know you keep your ear to the ground, typically on all things state and local government. Can you share your thoughts on how these national budget cuts might impact, say, the state budget, and how that in turn could impact nonprofits.
Yeah, Valerie, and unless you're willing to give me about 6 hours to walk through all the different ways
Wow.
that could possibly happen, what I'm going to do is highlight what's going on. And these federal employment cuts, they're all coming within a context. And so when the Trump administration came in the door, they said they wanted to cut the federal workforce by 65%. That's the number they put on the table, 65%. And in fact, an order went out to every federal agency that they must submit reduction in force plans to get up to that 65% level, either by March 13th or April 14th. So these are some deadlines that agencies are working under. Even before that deadline hits, under the actions taken by Elon Musk and DOGE, there have been thousands of federal employees already riffed. Health and Human Services is down 5,200 employees. The IRS is down 6,700 employees. The National Park Service is down 3,400 employees. The same National Park Service that could protect states like California from fires breaking out and spreading, just saying. Pentagon down 5,400. Now, a much smaller agency, the National Nuclear Security Administration, which does safety inspections of nuclear facilities across the country, down 350 employees. Why we would want to cut employees at the agency that ensures nuclear power is being provided in a safe fashion is beyond me, but that's been on the cutting block. The EPA has just been under the crosshairs of the Trump administration since it's come in the door. And then even some smaller cuts really are bad for anyone who cares about good government, good public policy. I will point out that the Department of Education has a little small working group within it called the Institute of Educational Sciences. What they do is they track things like student achievement over time, so they could identify if there are gaps in achievement, by race, by income, by ethnicity. How are American students performing academically? Their budget was cut by $900 million. They are not going to be able to continue to provide people who do education work and education policy sort of data you need to do a longitudinal analysis to determine whether or not any specific educational practices are in fact paying off. Are they evidence-based? Where are the gaps going? Are we getting them smaller, which is the hope of everyone, right? Or are they getting greater, et cetera? They cut aid to the emergency workers who responded to the 9/11 terrorist attack and are now suffering from toxins related to what they inhaled while they did this work. The aid for those heroes has been cut in the name of efficiency. I'm saying that's probably not in the best interest of anyone. And this is just the beginning, because if you read the papers today, the House budget resolution that the Republicans passed promises more of these kinds of challenges coming right down the road. I'm just going to highlight a couple of features of it. They've identified $4.5 trillion. Now, this is the price tag over the next 10 years of tax cuts they want to implement. They haven't gotten specific about what those tax cuts will be, but they are all paying lip service to the 2017 tax cuts under President Trump last time he was in office. And those tax cuts, by every independent analysis, disproportionately benefited the wealthiest, not 10%, 1% in the nation, and the wealthiest businesses. And that's problematic because the way they've identified how to pay for that is they want to cut $2 trillion worth of spending, once again, no specificity, in the next 10 years across the federal budget. Now, the only way you can get to a figure like $2 trillion is if Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security are on the table. There's just not enough money in any of the other federal agencies to come anywhere near a $2 trillion figure. The Republicans themselves, who debated this, have gone on record as saying Medicaid in particular and food assistance programs are the ones that they really want to look at for cuts. And they've instructed through this budget resolution, the Energy and Commerce Commission, which oversees Medicaid and Medicare, to find $800 billion in cuts to those programs in the next 10 years. So I want to talk about what that would mean for Illinois and then some other things that are happening in Illinois. And then I'll let somebody else talk, because if you just want numbers about the uglies, I could literally, Valerie, I could keep you here all night. So I'm not going to do that.
Okay, got it.
The Medicaid program right now funds almost 50% of all births in America. 50% of all births. Remember, Medicaid is the program that provides health insurance coverage to poor Americans for the most part. It covers 70 million Americans, and the ACA expansion that happened actually added 21 million Americans to that coverage list. It increased enrollment, and the federal government subsidized that increased enrollment by paying 90% of the cost of that increased enrollment, only putting 10% on the states. As things stand now, they at a minimum, and this is in the plans, you can go find this stuff, they at a minimum want to save $560 billion by cutting Medicaid, and in particular, the ACA enhanced enrollment. So they want to reduce these new folks that just came online. 40 states participated in the ACA expansion under Medicaid. 10 of those states, including Illinois, have what's called trigger laws. So if this federal match goes below that 90% rate, that automatically ends the Medicaid expansion program in the state with the trigger law. Illinois has one. So in Illinois, what that would be would a cost of $7.5 billion if we didn't have this trigger law, and 700,000 individuals who got health insurance through the expansion would be thrown off the rolls. And that's Illinois. The Congressional Budget Office has projected that if this program goes into effect nationally, 2 million people will lose health insurance in 2026. Another 3.7 million will lose it in 2027. And another 3.8 million will lose health insurance coverage every year through 2034. And every independent agency that's looked at this, including health insurance companies and their consultants, have said if this happens, health insurance premiums for the rest of America will skyrocket. That's one little snapshot. The Illinois budget itself, it's an interesting thing. Right now, the state has identified $1.88 billion in federal grants that have not been dispersed, that have either been fully contracted for or awarded. About $692 million of that is obligated to 9 different state agencies right now under contract, but the money is not coming out the door. Another $1.19 billion is going to another 10 states that has been awarded. Now the federal government is no longer responding to follow through on the award and disperse the money. These state agencies include the Illinois State Board of Education, Health and Family Services, Department of Transportation, Economic Development, and it covers everything from supporting small business and solar development to veterans, AIDS prevention and health, mental health, developmental disabilities, support for senior citizens, support for children with developmental disabilities. So these are the programs right now where we were anticipating receiving $1.88 billion of federal transfers that's being held up. Now you look at our general fund, the state of Illinois' general fund, it's about a $52 billion fund, but not all of that goes to services. A number of that goes to hard costs like debt that the state has to pay and things like that. When you look at our services budget this year, it's about $37.9 billion. $4 billion of that is federal funding, 10%.
Yeah.
It's unclear what's going to happen to that 4%. When you look at the bigger overall budget, which includes capital and transit and all that other stuff, it's about $118 billion, but scarily 30% of that, or $35 billion plus federal dollars. So this is just a snapshot of what could be coming our way, and certainly what has come our way already. None of it good. All of it will create significant negative economic multipliers that will reduce our private sector growth in the next few years, relatively significant. So there's the snapshot, Valerie. I can go into more detail, but it's somebody else's turn.
Okay. Oh, that sounds horrible. It sounds like they're going to cut us all the way into a recession. If this continues, we're going to be in probably a depression. This is just awful.
Yeah, you're right. The negative impacts of this. So there's a gentleman by the name of Marc Zandy. He's a PhD economist at Moody's, the bond rating agency. And Marc Zandy looks at fiscal impacts of different actions, tax cuts, tax increases, spending cuts, spending increases. And he doesn't really do much goofy stuff. What he does is he looks backwards and says, what has actually happened? And then he comes up with multipliers for the impact. Every time you've cut spending on public services like education or healthcare, et cetera, for every dollar you cut in spending, the private sector loses about $1.36 of economic activity.
Wow.
That is a major negative economic multiplier that reverberates through the private sector. So these cuts, which are being talked about, I think, inappropriately as efficiency cuts, because this has nothing to do with efficiency. There's been no study. There's been no look at the agencies. There's been no determination of which maybe should be eliminated. I'd be all for eliminating inefficient extra positions that we don't need and the taxpayer dollars are being wasted on. That's not what's going on here. What's going on here is really uninformed slash and burn. And that's good either for the provision of public services or for the private sector.
Awful. Congressman Davis, when I think of the Ways and Means Committee and the impact it could have, I guess, on the starting of new nonprofits, right? If they're going to be closing some of these positions with the IRS, I would imagine one of the things we're going to see is a much slower processing of new applications for nonprofits. And I can imagine there are other impacts. Is there a subcommittee within the Ways and Means Committee that's looking at nonprofits specifically and what those impacts could be?
You said this was it sounded like it would be horrible. It is horrible. One of the things that I learned pretty early in life is that all behavior has meaning. There is a reason for it. If you go in the kitchen to cook,
Okay.
you are cooking for a purpose. You're not just cooking because it's something to do. You have a purpose. You intend to eat. If you get in your car, you're not going to just drive it anywhere. You're going to drive it where you're going. All behavior has meaning. And so the architects of this have a reason. They're not just doing it willy-nilly. They're doing it. Ways and Means is supposedly and is the committee in the House that figures out how to pay for things and what you're going to pay for and where your money is going to come from. And of course, you can't have anything unless you can implement whatever it is that you're trying to do. And we figure out, supposedly, in reality, where do you get the money to pay for whatever the services are that you're going to provide? Who do you tax? And different people have different thoughts and ideas about taxation. One of our justices said one time, and I believe him, that taxation is the price that you pay for a civilized society. And so whatever you're going to do, the purpose of all of this, to the best of what I've been able to determine, is to not have to raise appropriate taxes on the wealthiest individuals in our country. You heard about the taxation plan that the president had 2017. That seems to be an idea that if we cut all these programs, we stop spending this money, now we can give some more tax break to the wealthiest individuals in our country. And we may as well know that. And we may as well understand that and understand what this is about. It took hundreds of years for workers to have rights, certain kind of rights. They didn't just get them all at one time. They went through, you get a little bit this year, you get a little bit this year. And they are just willy-nilly firing workers. For example, last week, the Internal Revenue Service fired 7,000 employees. And they announced they're going to close 120 of these little taxpayer assistance centers that I send people to that I know don't really know how to file the income tax to get the best results. Because some people don't have to file, some people this, some people if you do that. These are wonderful centers that people can go to and get the information, especially low-income people. You talked earlier about how many not-for-profits there are in America and in the state. My congressional district have more not-for-profits on an average than many other places because of who the people are who live here. Many of these individuals migrated from the rural South. Their families didn't have the opportunity for certain kinds of education and information. They came here looking, and they found some hope and some help. No, this is an assault on quality of life for all kind of people. If you're a physician and you got 50 patients who pay you or that you get paid from Medicare, and so they get, if them get cut off, all the money gets reduced. Now you got 30 patients. And so it's not just affecting the poor or low income, it's affecting people who rely on an economic booster that the federal government, and we've always had not-for-profit. Lexity talked early in this country as it was evolving into a country that people would form things and do things themselves, not wait for the government to do them. I got 23 hospitals in my congressional district alone. Guess what? Medicare, reduction of Medicare payment, especially for those that are called disproportionate share hospitals, they don't know if they will be able to keep or stay in business. They just don't know if they will stay in business. These community health centers, they're being cut. They're going to be cut. So these changes are just unbelievable. And the only thing to do Yeah, you can look at every individual agency. You can look at find me something that makes sense that they are doing, and they say we need to reduce the number of people who work for the federal government. There are people who are gold bricking. There are people who don't work. There are people who claim they're working at home and they out shopping. There are people. All of this stuff is speculation. We have not been given any concrete show me who the people are, where they are. And so it's an effort. It just really is. You can try to rationalize it. You can try and say, and economically, how could it make any sense if the rich people keep getting money that all they can do with it is hoard it and not circulate it? I'm understanding that the best way to have a balanced economy or have an economy that is functioning is to keep the money from flowing from one place to another, goods and services impacting on each other. It's like blood to the body. If you get too much blood on one side of the body, you got a problem. You get too much money in the hands of too few people, you got a problem. And that's where I think we're headed. So, yeah, they may get richer, but the economy as a whole gets weaker. And that's where I think these policies are leading us. And that's why we got to just keep fighting.
Yes, and thank you so much for that. And so it sounds to me like it's really going to be a greater need for social services, and the government in and of itself is not going to be able to support
Yeah,
all
but
of
how
that.
can you get them if nobody is available to
Yep.
provide them? The not-for-profits have to shut down if they don't have any money to operate. They can't do it without resources.
All right, thank you. I am going to pause the questions that I had prepared for the panel just for a moment and give people from the audience an opportunity to weigh in on the discussion. And then if there's time afterwards, we can go back. Just bear with me. I'm going through the comments section. All right, Rochelle, do you want to ask your own question? Either read it or ask it yourself. Rochelle Michael, are you there? All right, Rochelle Michael, she had a question. She says, can we have the number of cuts and how each will affect the people? I don't believe most people are aware of the volume and ramifications. I thought Ralph touched on that.
Yeah, Valerie, it's really impossible at this juncture to have a comprehensive list of all the cuts. I tried to run through some of the highlights of data that you can find. It's interesting. On the one hand, Musk keeps saying that DOGE is the most transparent agency, blah, blah, blah. That's really one of their talking points. They repeat a lot. On the other hand, they are very much not transparent. And I think Congressman Danny Davis correctly pointed out they have not justified a lot of the cuts they've claimed they've made by showing any underlying data that indicates these cuts needed to be made, that the people on the jobs were not doing the jobs or whatever. And they haven't even substantiated the full dollar amount of the cuts they've made. But we do know the positions lost. And I think we just have to continue monitoring that situation very closely. And as data becomes available for those of us who do care about silly little things like facts, to get that data out to others who still care about silly little things like that. I know this current presidential administration seems to be fact blind. I would like to follow up on one thing Congressman Danny Davis said, though, because it's not only accurate, but people don't understand what it really means when they hear it. Yeah, it's bad when nonprofits that are out there in the community providing services, helping with whatever, lose funding and have to go out of business. But once they go out of business, it's not like they get replaced immediately or sometimes ever when the funding returns. So if you could recall back to the days of the administration of Governor Bruce Rauner here in Illinois, where we didn't have a state budget for 2 years in a row. It's a record. No state in the history of America has ever done that except the great state of Illinois. We are so proud of our fiscal track policy. That said, when the state funding got slashed for human services in particular, human services aren't really provided by the state. They are pretty much done on a contract and grant basis with nonprofits throughout Illinois. A bunch of the human services infrastructure went out of business, and it still hasn't been replaced today. So there are things like no domestic violence counseling and treatment centers in Marion, Illinois. Why? The funding was cut years ago, and people went on to do other things or left the state, and no one's been able to start it back up and get it going. So these cuts really create long-term havoc in the infrastructure that really supports some of the most vulnerable people in our society. And I just mentioned domestic violence, but think about it. I think about things always in dollars and cents standpoint, right? And so the cost of providing counseling to an individual who has violent tendencies is about $6,500, $7,000 per year. And that helps prevent this individual from committing violent acts. You lose that, and this person will abuse their spouse, their girlfriend, their boyfriend, whatever. They will. And in some cases, that abuse will be so bad that the person will have to go to jail because they so brutally beat another individual. The cost of incarcerating an individual in Illinois is close to $50,000 a year versus the $7,000 it cost us to provide this individual counseling. Oh, but we're not done with the costs we've just imposed upon ourselves, because the people in that family, be they the children that witnessed or were the victims of the violence, the spouse, the girlfriend, the boyfriend, whoever they were, they will also need counseling. And they've lost the income of the incarcerated individual who committed the abuse. We are talking about a vicious negative spiral down in one family's life and a vicious spiral up in costs to the public sector because of the failure to continue funding one small human service. So the impacts have very much a compounding effect as they go through.
Awesome. Marc, did you want to respond before we answer Sharonda's question?
I'm happy to hear what Sharonda has to say.
Okay. Sharonda, your hand was up. Want to share your question?
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me clearly?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
Lovely, lovely. So I'm Sharonda Hosendorf. I am the founder and CEO of We Cope Inc. It's a community outreach program engagement. That's what COPE stands for. But we do a lot of support in the community. We're very grassroots. We just made a year old. And it's just what the gentleman who shared earlier. It's almost like double trauma for the people that we serve, just because they were already coming out of these very uncertain situations like DV, homelessness, and things like that. And so finally, when they are stabilized in housing, a few of my programs that I help with is getting them furniture so they can stabilize, getting them jobs, getting them to school, getting their kids settled in school. So just to find that this has just become such a huge impact to my nonprofit is really troubling. And a lot of the funding that I get from parent companies like United Way and the bigger ones, I've gained some traction over the past year that I've been in business and everything. However, now those things aren't as clear. And so just thinking about everything that I've learned so far, I had a question about now moving forward as a founder and even talking to other partnering companies. Where could we find the most credible information to keep us abreast? Because right now I'm just following like the Nonprofit Alliance and things like that. I just want to make sure that we are not sharing misinformation as well. And that if we could give some balance or even some comfort in some of the things that we can do in the interim until we can find out everything, what would be a good way to go about that?
Let me just say, we had hoped to be able to increase appropriations for agriculture and get the U.S. Department of Agriculture more engaged in urban farming. And rather than them going to have money to promote urban farming programs, I happen to be involved with several. They won't even give the rural farm. The people who, the regular rural farmers who voted for Mr. Trump, they can't even get the support or get the money that had been promised to them released so that they can continue to do what they do in providing food. And they told that things was going to go down a little bit. And now you can't even buy eggs. The price of eggs is so high. Until I grew up on a farm. And of course, we had eggs and chickens. And matter of fact, one of my first projects before each club was to raise 100 Rhode Island red chickens. And we had plenty of eggs too, but you got to just hang in there, search around every place that you can look, be as frugal as you can be, and try to keep your group and your organization going until we can turn this around.
I do have comments on Congressman Davis's comment as well as Valerie's mention in chat. So first, Valerie identifies Forefront, which is a very reliable source of information. They also maintain a considerable library on these issues. What's unusual about Forefront, among other things, is they're a 501c3 with two constituencies, operating charities, but also funders, foundations. So they get to look at things through different lenses, and they're a pretty good broker of relationships as well. So that's one source. But in addition to that, I do want to provide a couple of other thoughts here. One is the mission you've described, as you've described it, falls within the sweet spot of DEI. And what I have been working with clients on doing is reframing mission in a way that is accurate, but not necessarily drawing attention and scrutiny to DEI programming. For example, which I've heard you say, and we could talk about this perhaps offline, but what you're doing strikes me as just as readily structured as community development or education or workforce development, without reference in any specific way to those aspects which may signal DEI and therefore scrutiny and therefore retaliation in one way or another. The other thing, queuing off Congressman Davis's point, if in fact you were to get involved in urban farming, now you're in my sweet spot, and that is the development of earned revenue. To the extent a nonprofit can become less dependent on government support, and for that matter, philanthropic support, but looking at your core competencies and your underutilized assets, what kind of a business might you create that affords you the ability to diversify sources of funding, but also at the same time drive mission? And to the extent you could do that, there are techniques and structures and designs which allow you to put those businesses in different entities that are not dependent upon tax-deductible donations or tax exemption, yet where the revenue would drive your programming or would be reinvested in the growth of that social enterprise. So I'd give thought to risk management. I'd give thought to mitigation of scrutiny And I'd also look at ways in which you might recast mission in a way that is accurate, legitimate, authentic to you and to your board as fiduciaries, but which does not necessarily call attention to what you're doing on the DEI side as overtly as I just heard you describe it. So that's just a word of caution.
All right, awesome. I think we're probably not going to have time to go through the prepared questions. I think we have quite a few questions in the chat that will spark a lot of really good discussion. Adrian, you had a question about the elimination of DEI. Did you want to ask your question yourself? I know you put it in the chat, but it always sounds better to me to have people.
Yeah, you
Ask
know,
their own
I would be just as easy with you reading it. Let me take a look and see. I think I was talking about, okay, so with the DEI questions, because I actually had two.
Yeah, the first.
Well, the first one, let me go back. And my question basically is probably more for Congressman Davis, but whoever can answer it. And so I'm wondering, isn't reduction in force is a no fault termination. So how will the federal RIF impact the joint state federal unemployment insurance system? Because I'm guessing that
Well,
people are going to come to their local state offices for assistance. Is there any particular plan for addressing that?
okay,
Okay, something to think about.
it
Uh,
is. It is.
and
And let's.
the second question, with a DEI elimination affects women and minority business enterprises and veterans business enterprises. So what would this mean to mission-driven organizations who are possibly in the 8A SBA program? I've got a client who's freaking out right now because anything that he potentially could bid on looks like it might be going away.
He would just bid like all other bidders. There would not be any assistance or any special points or any special help. And we already know that these companies don't have much money, access to capital. Most businesses that come to me and ask for help, and what is the help that they're looking for? They're looking for help to obtain business. And of course, they're looking for capital. They're looking for a way to try and convince the purchasing agents that they're going to be able to do a good job and provide what it is that they need to have. So it really means they won't get any help.
And possibly wind up being relegated to a subcontractor role with a dominant provider.
If they can manage to get that.
Wow. Okay.
Not 20. Fahim, did you want to read your questions?
Yes, ma'am. Good evening to everybody. Ms. Valerie, you know, I love the work that you do in the community. Absolutely. Had to be here. But my thing is, I understand where the government is. I think everybody understands where the government is. I think everybody understands the current state of affairs. And I don't really want to go back and forth on that piece so much as I want to ask now, how does the non-for-profit community as a body of people, how do we begin to work together to strengthen each other and leverage, right, what we do in community to ensure that we can stay in the game? And what I mean by that is you have larger organizations that are going to have access to millions. You have medium organizations that's going to have access to hundreds of thousands. So what becomes the plan for us operating north, east, west, south in Chicago? How do we begin to align ourselves in order that we can circulate those dollars right? One, between ourselves, and then two, to ensure that the people who we serve will have access. And what I mean by that is that the money may come, the money may not come, but the question becomes, how do we begin to strategically make use of those dollars and make use of those partnerships in order that we as a whole can stay afloat? And I know that's a crazy question, a crazy statement, but looking at the fact that who I'm asking for may not give it to me, what am I going to be willing to do for myself? So how do we begin the projects of committing ourselves to building gardens inside of the community? How do we commit ourselves to ensuring that the services that we prepare at the immediate level, food, shelter, and clothing, how do we ensure that those things continue on while we're waiting for the United States government? And the only reason that I say that is because what we do is what we do, right? The Ukraine received $132 billion in subsidies from the world community, and $114 billion of that was created by the U.S. government. So to be perfectly honest, I really don't care what Elon Musk is doing because they're printing up money for when they need it. And so whatever the process is going on, how do we, as people, boots on the ground, what are we going to begin to do to plan to ensure that, one, we can operate effectively, and then two, we can ensure more conscientious use of those finances so that we can ensure that we have quality work for Illinois residents, if that makes sense.
I think it does. I think what you do is be as good as you can possibly be in terms of the services you provide, whatever those are. I think Martin Luther King laid out a blueprint when he used to say, if you were shining shoes, be the best person shining shoes in the neighborhood, and people will beat a path to your door. So I would say be as good as you can be, but then also pay close attention to the foundations that also have resources, and keep trying to convince the government agencies who have whatever they have that you're so good. If they've got anything to share or anything to give, come to us. Come to my agency. Let us do it. If it's violence prevention, no matter what it is, just be good. Be good.
I'd like to build on the congressman's suggestion, if I may. We're seeing town hall meetings convened by Republicans as well as Democrats, and the Republicans are getting the pushback, and it seems to be motivating them to ask some questions. Asking questions may or may not yield answers, but it could lead to various kinds of steps. So in addition to what the congressman recommends in terms of being your best and warrant funding as an individual organization, I would also suggest that there be mobilization of nonprofits, creation of coalitions of nonprofits. And nonprofits are increasingly backing away from advocacy for fear of retaliation, for fear of being conspicuous. However, at this point, we should rely upon the law as it exists, Trump notwithstanding. And the law as it exists does allow public charities to lobby. And with a 501H election, that lobbying can be very substantial. And it also allows private foundations, which have lots of money, to fund public charity projects that involve lobbying without designating grant funds to lobbying. And C3s can also advocate mission through educational issue, advocacy on administrative regulations, which is what we're looking at, and advocacy against executive orders is also specifically called out within the Internal Revenue regulations. They also can advance boycotts and litigation, which they're already doing on their own or in combination with states. And they can pursue pro-democracy activities, get out the vote and voter registration drives. We are approaching the time when the midterms will be in our sights. And perhaps most important in this conversation, C3s are without limit permitted to engage in self-defense lobbying. There's no constraint at all, including communications with legislators or regulators or others that might affect the existence of the organization, that might affect its powers, its duties, its tax exemption, the deductibility of donations in its favor. That's without limit, and that's a First Amendment right. Then organizations that have social welfare within their missions can, in fact, conduct activities to eliminate prejudice and discrimination and the defense of human and civil rights secured by law. And those are lawful charitable donations and deductions, notwithstanding what's going on with discrimination, equity, inclusion, those prohibitions. So if we look at the First Amendment piece of this and the 501c3 piece of this, which is ingrained in the law since 1939, there are ample opportunities for nonprofits to coalesce and do that which is in their collective best interest and secure funding from foundations and individuals and others who care about this stuff and see the nonprofit community as the vanguard of change, which historically has been its mission and its purpose and its function. So that strikes me as a very useful construct to think about from the perspective of the leadership of multiple nonprofits that have shared concerns, shared values, even though they may have different missions and different activities. Because the truth is, that which one nonprofit does is almost inevitably going to be complementary to the mission of many other nonprofits. We're all in this together, it's often said, and it's true. Because if you can help disinvested communities and marginalized populations and the unemployed and the unhoused, they may be labeled as specific, discrete missions of this or that organization, but the externalities of each of those organizations' activities positively impact the missions of all the others. So that would be one thought I would float.
Mark, thank you for saying that, because if individuals know the law and know what they can actually do and know that there are opportunities for advocacy within the law for them, then I think they're more likely to do it.
And again, and that doesn't really encroach upon the notion, ill-advised in my view, of the unitary executive. Because unless we're saying that this country ought not have any nonprofit organizations, and I don't think there's any country in the world that doesn't have NGOs, including those countries that are totalitarian. So as long as that's the case, the rules of the road are clearly documented. We have the Internal Revenue Code and the rules and regulations promulgated under the Internal Revenue Code and the case law interpreting that. So unless we're going to throw that all out, and that's, we're a long way from there, it seems to me those powers and those authorities exist for individuals. And then I also don't want to omit in this the importance of the private sector. Increasingly, public companies and significant private companies have expanded what corporate social responsibility means. It's no longer just writing a check. It's no longer sponsoring a parade. It's in fact engaging with the social sector in a meaningful way. Middle management wants to work for companies whose culture encourages sourcing goods and services from enterprising nonprofits or for-profit social enterprises. They want to mentor those organizations. So to the extent that those kinds of relationships can be brokered, there's funding available. There's infrastructure available. There's the leveraging of platforms of the executives of those companies and the shareholders of those companies. Sure, some companies have backed away because they don't want to be seen as supporting DEI, because they fear retaliation. But just as many companies have embraced DEI, by whatever label, because consumers see that as important based upon their own core values. So I think there's a lot of opportunity within the private sector for the social sector to engage with them. So I'll stop there, but it seems to me that kind of some seeds there to think about.
And I'll just supplement. Yeah, I agree with everything the Congressman and Marc just said. Really good job, Marc. But there's one more thing, and that's the private sector cannot make up for what the public sector doesn't do sustainably over. Just cannot. And in this environment, that advocacy that you do can't be preaching in choir. You got to convert new souls. You've got to be out there speaking to folks and advocating with folks that are in leadership positions in the party that's in power, in addition to Democratic.
Ralph, you're exactly right. But what I'm referring to here.
No, I know what you're referring to, Marc.
not
I'm
for
saying,
private-
I'm
just
saying
let me
expand
fin-
it
let me
back
finish
out a
the
little
point.
bit politically. Let me finish mine. Expand it out politically to cover Republicans, because we tend to just talk to other progressives. We tend to just talk to companies that do things that we agree with. In this environment, it is crucial to put pressure on the Republicans that are supportive of this particular presidential administration. And everything else you said, Marc, I completely agree with, and go ahead and supplement that. But we gotta have our advocacy.
I actually agree with you. And my thought was not for the private sector's investment in the social sector to replace public funding. That's impossible. What I was referring to, however, was catalytic capital to empower coalitions of nonprofits to do just that, to knock on the doors of representatives, irrespective of party affiliation. Because the Democrats have their own view, which more neatly squares with what we're talking about here, although not exclusively. And the Republicans generally, I think, support much of this too, but they're acting like a possum. I heard James Carville use that term. In fact, he suggested that Democrats act like a possum and let the Republicans self-destruct. I'm not necessarily a fan of that idea, although I think James is usually pretty on the money. But I was really worrying about getting some seed capital to fund advocacy efforts so as to knock on those doors. So I think we're probably on the same page there, and I appreciate your comment as well, Ralph.
Okay. Question, Marc, do you have any names of funders that might be willing to fund such advocacy? And
Let's say it this way, to this degree, and I think people will start filling in the blanks as I describe them. I was referring to private foundations by law are obliged to distribute at least 5% of their assets annually for charitable, educational, other purposes. This is what accounts for the feverish competition for grants among charities. Also, there is such a thing as a program-related investment, which is another avenue by which foundations can meet that statutory requirement. So you're talking about a universe of prospective funders who are obliged by law to kick out real money every year and collectively very big money. So if you thought about, and you probably have some already on your radar, significant, let's say, Chicago area private foundations, they typically have names attached to them, often family foundations, and then there are also corporate foundations. All of the public companies have their own foundations, and they are not permitted to support or oppose candidates or political policies and the like. But here we're talking about something different. Here we're talking about a philosophy of empowering the social sector to get their job done. And because if government doesn't do the things we're talking about, and the social sector doesn't do those things, they simply don't get done to the detriment of all of society. So this is a different argument altogether. I'm making this apolitical because I think in reality, we have a shared mission as residents of a community and citizens of a country to make sure that our lives and the lives of our children and our grandchildren can be as good as they can be. And there are different ways that gets manifested, and different techniques and different tactics and different strategies, but all of it requires the will to do it. And all of it requires the funding to make it happen. And I'm only looking now for catalytic funding, so as to sit down and have those conversations, have that advocacy, have those boycotts, have those protests, have those educational sessions, raise those issues, and do it in a way where we could have, you see what happens at town halls when a Republican congressman convenes 200 or 300 people. Imagine if we had all the C3s in the city of Chicago do that. How many thousands or tens of thousands of people we could coalesce around these kinds of issues, all of which is permissible under the statute and in fact encouraged.
Okay. We would be willing to support the effort to whoever is pulling together people citywide.
I need to do one other thing, and that is give a little ad, if I may.
Yes,
Consistent with the
please.
mission, and Valerie, I think you know this is coming.
Yeah.
There is one of the questions that wasn't asked of me, but was intended to have been asked had the questions not been as energetic as they were, and that is, what's going on with local governments to help supplement that which the federal government isn't doing and can't do? We could talk about a lot of stuff at different layers of government, but one thing I want to talk about is the Cook County Commission on Social Innovation. It is a permanent agency of county government. I was privileged to draft the ordinance creating it. And it incubates actionable social policy recommendations for the Cook County Board. All that it has done has been universally approved by the county board. It has become law in the county. And it's all intended to optimize social impact for the residents of the county in a multi-sectoral way, bringing together business, governments, funders, lenders, all kinds of folks. That entity, which I serve as vice chair, and a separate entity, a nonprofit called Social Enterprise Chicago, which I happen to serve as president currently. That entity is a convener, a collaborator, a catalyst seeking to drive market-based solutions to social problems. Those two entities, the government unit and the nonprofit unit, are joining forces to have a symposium on April 4th at UIC. And there'll be lots of folks attending whose names policymakers, leaders in the social enterprise community and otherwise. And we're going to have a morning event from 8 in the morning till noon. It's free. And you're going to hear about what the county is doing currently to help social enterprises, nonprofits that are pursuing or considering pursuing an earned revenue strategy. And we're also going to talk about state-of-the-art social enterprise strategies that Social Enterprise Chicago is familiar with. It's an educational event. You'll learn about all kinds of policies and all kinds of things that you may not know about yet if you want to diversify funding as a nonprofit or as a social purpose business. And so I wanted to mention all that. If you're interested, we'd appreciate your registering, although there is no charge. If you go to my Facebook page, for example, you'll see an invite, and you can just click on it, put in your name, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Adrian, did I miss anything that I should have said? She's on our board at Social Enterprise Chicago.
No, you covered everything. I was just trying to find a way to share the invitation.
They can come to my Facebook page and
Right.
they'll see it there. And we'd love to have everyone there. And
The other thing they can do is they can search Eventbrite for Social Enterprise 2025. And they can register directly that way.
Christopher Raphael has just put into the chat box the link. Thank you for that, Christopher.
Okay.
And
Again,
I think your beard is terrific.
Search Eventbrite Social Enterprise 2025. And you should be able to go directly to the link for registration.
And I think you'll find it. There will also be, the other thing I should mention, because I talked about coalition, there will be opportunities for networking, learning from one another, combining forces with one another, critically important. They say at conferences or conventions, you do more good in the hallway between the meetings than you do at the meetings. Hopefully these meetings will be very valuable to you, but you will meet other people and people that can do you some good and for whom you can do some good. So I encourage you to attend, and I'd love to see all of you there.
Okay. And I can also email the information to everyone on the list.
Oh, wonderful.
I have it as well.
Thank you, Valerie. Very much appreciate that.
Okay, we got time for one more question. LaShawn, I know your hand has been up for forever. LaShawn Miller.
Yes. Hello, my name is LaShawn Miller. So my question was surrounded about the agriculture issue. I'm a local farmer here in the city of Chicago, and I also work as a policy organizer for the Illinois Stewardship Alliance. What we have seen is a lot of the government funding has been affecting us. My question was surrounded around the funding freeze, where a lot of our farmers have gotten federally funded grants as a reimbursement grant, where they have spent their own money for infrastructure and other things. So now they don't know, one, if they will ever get paid back for the money that has already been spent under the contract, and two, if the program will continue in the future. We also found out today, sorry, I'm out of breath. We also found out today that there's another grant that's out there. It's called the Local Food Purchasing Grant. They stopped the money, so a lot of farmers have been growing their business in order to sell to an agency who then in turn sends the purchased food to food banks. So today we were informed that they would no longer be purchasing our produce to provide for the food banks. And also, the food that has been delivered as of the month of February, that those invoices may or may not be paid because of the funding freeze. So the question is, for those that need to do the spending, and for those who have spent their money and are waiting for reimbursement funds, how do you think, or what advice could you give to those to stay afloat while they're waiting on money that is due to them, if that makes sense?
I think the money that is due to them, the courts may end up being the last word on that. And we've had some help from the court that has been balanced, more balanced than I think some people thought they were going to be. And I felt very good about that. Monies that are due you, for example, I've made several calls to agencies on behalf of people who had grants pending that they were supposed to have been getting the money about. I admit that some of the agencies are not answering their telephones in terms of figuring that those are things that people are calling about. But in a couple of instances, even though they didn't answer the call, they did end up releasing those grant money for those entities. If you've got specifics, you may want to ask your congressman. If it's me, I'll make the call to the agency and inquire and ask about it. But I think the courts are the big determinant in terms of helping to make sure these monies have already been appropriated. They've already been approved. And I can't think of any particular reason that the agencies should not, other than Musk has told them to hold it. So we can try and help you with that.
Yeah, because I guess the question is, I know no one has the answer of how long do we have to wait, right? But in the meantime, if there's nowhere to sell this food, where does it go, right? And for those who are affected by this EQIP grant, where it was for infrastructure, they've paid thousands of dollars for things, waiting, and the costs go up depending on what it was. But to have spent that money already, and now they're in a deficit and can't pay for things like seeds or whatever is needed to start a new season, we understand that there's a holding period and there's a waiting period. But because we spent this money, where do we get money to sustain us moving forward?
I don't know where you get that, but we'll try to get that which due you from the federal government.
Mark, are you aware? I had read, and I can't remember the name, that a bunch of farmers were getting together and filing a suit to try to compel payment for these very things, LaShawn. But I cannot remember the name of the group. I thought maybe Mark would have heard of that. But Congressman Davis is right. At the end of the day, you may have to try to force their hand through some collaborative lawsuit with you and other similarly situated farmers who are being stiffed, even though you have the contractual right to receive this reimbursement.
Yeah, because it wasn't a firm no, you're not getting the money. It's just that the entities are saying it's frozen. So it's like there's no expected end date. So I get you can file a lawsuit if you have a contract and they're just saying this is the end of it, but that hasn't quite happened. The money is frozen. To our understanding, you'll get paid. It's just we don't know when. But in we don't know when period,
if
we're
I may say
struggling.
this, there are a number of pending lawsuits relating to frozen funds as opposed to stopped funds. And the arguments that have been raised, typically these have been done with the state. The Attorney General would be a plaintiff along with your organization or other similarly situated organizations, indicating that the freezes violates federal administrative law and disrupt essential community programs. Those are the two prongs to that sort of litigation.
Can I talk to you about that further?
Sure.
Because the organization that I work for, we're actually trying to figure out how we are going to collectively move forward to make a difference. And that kind
maybe
of like
this becomes part of a broader conversation as well.
Yeah, for sure.
And look at that, the nonprofit community holistically might be the best play because strength in numbers.
Mm-hmm. And I can put you two in contact with one another, LaShawn and Mark.
Thank you.
Alrighty. I see two people have made suggestions as you were talking. They were looking at banks as a solution.
Green Bank.
Yeah, Green Bank. And yeah, I don't know, Veronica, did you have any specific thoughts on that?
Sure, I'll share it. So Green Bank have been used, for example, let's say, I'll give a specific example. A house of worship received a grant to put solar on their roof, but it is a reimbursement grant. They didn't have the funds to do the work up front to be reimbursed. A Green Bank in Illinois does have one, will upfront the funds and then be reimbursed when the reimbursement grant comes through. So I don't know if they would do farming like this, but it was an idea because I know they do that. They exist and that they do that, for example, for solar projects.
Okay. And John, you mentioned something about municipal bank partners, and it's great to see you again. Can you elaborate on that? All right.
The City of Chicago and CPS, they both operate through the council for municipal bank deposits. And so there's been a big delay for 2 years about issuing a new agreement because their city council agreed that the banks are just not investing as they should in Black communities. So they were withholding the vote for a while. But in the meantime, all those banks do want to show that they care. And it's important for communities to at least reach out to them and say, could you help us financially? And they go good for their community lending record as well, because their lending record is pretty poor in the Black community. But the other thing is that what gets to me, one of the hidden, I don't want to say total benefits, but the hidden benefit of what's going on with these freezes, and I don't talk about it very much, is that we do have a long history in Illinois where the groups who begin all this federal money never really talk to people very much. The other thing is they have the lobbyists, and we never could use the lobbyists. Every year, the lobbyists were denied us on a lot of these urban conversations. This is the point, and what Mark mentioned earlier, this is a golden opportunity to get everybody together so we're in the same pot. Let's work together and stop having these isolated conversations with your lobbyist teams and with Springfield, and include these urban areas in these conversations and to build up that base. So it's a moment for us to get people together, because to a large degree, people have not been working together. And that March 14th deadline that I put on there provides an opportunity for us to begin talking through, get these groups with all these lobbyists in our neighborhoods. We see them all the time, but they ain't talking about their lobbyists. Give us access so we can make a team effort in Springfield and in Chicago.
What's happening March 14th?
That's the deadline that the feds has put on them having some agreement with the court about how to proceed. I think that from that February, I think what was it, February 3rd? Yeah, February 3rd was that marching date that Springfield, with our Attorney General, kind of kicked off for them to work on some agreement about how to proceed. But March 14th was when it was to really say, how far have we come? What should we do next? So that is the deadline for a lot of these requests to be reviewed and released or withheld. So the freeze is happening, but for now to March 14th, they decided what we're going to let go, what we're going to release, what we're going to keep. And so they slowly sharing that, but at the same time, March 14th is the deadline.
Much time. All right. Thank you. I will be in touch with you. All right. So our time, we're about 10 minutes over. This conversation has been a wonderful conversation, and clearly there's a lot to be done. We just scratched the surface. At this point, I'm going to ask our panelists one by one to share closing statements. I will make sure everybody on the call gets a transcript as well as a link to the video. And I have a feeling this won't be our last conversation, but I do understand the need to also move to action. All right. So we'll start with you, Congressman Davis, and then we'll go with Mark and then Ralph. We'll do it in alphabetical order.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with all of you. I'll just say that the foundations are working on this issue also. As a matter of fact, they had a conference in DC. I've met with them on yesterday, many of them. We had a whole room filled. I've also been working on it. If you know or not know, charitable donations are down. I'm saying people are not given. So I have a bill that is designed to try and help them up what they give. It's called the Charitable Act. And I have a Republican sponsor along with me. And what it would do is restore the above the line deduction for those individuals who give but do not itemize. And so we hope that it's going to be a bipartisan piece of legislation that we can get passed and ultimately signed into law, and see if that will not help increase individual giving so that charitable not-for-profit groups will have more money with which to access. Again, bottom line is people have to be as educated as they can be, as political as they can become. And politics, I define, is that whenever two people interact, some politicking takes place. And if it does not, then one person is not necessary. And life is politics in terms of knowing what you believe, what you want, and what you will do to try and make it happen. So thank you all and have a great evening.
Thank you. Okay. Mark?
Yeah, I'll be brief. I just want to thank you, Valerie, for putting this together, and Congressman Davis and Ralph. It's a pleasure to serve on the panel with you. Your insights are extraordinary, as I knew they would be. And I'd like to thank all of the participants for your leadership, your commitments, your willingness to drive positive change. And without the environment that allows that to take place, it won't take place. As we start flexing that muscle, I think we'll start seeing some improvements. Look forward to collaborating with all of you one way or another in the future. It's a treat to be with you.
Yes, I can do that. Alrighty. And Ralph?
So I'm the only one between you and dinner. So I better be brief. I was once told by Senator Paul Simon, there's no such thing as a bad short speech. So all I'm going to say is, once again, to echo Mark and Congressman Davis's comments, I appreciate all the efforts you all put forth to make this a better state, a better community, a better city, a better world. I run a small nonprofit myself. We are woefully underfunded. I'd like to say we put the not in not-for-profit. So when things like this happen, it can be discouraging. However, we've managed to survive for 25 years through good and bad times. We will all manage to survive this. But collaborative work, where as much as possible we can be together in our advocacy efforts, and we could aim those advocacy efforts across the board at the unusual suspects, put political pressure on those who maybe have a different worldview than and are not in our type of inner circle to what we usually talk to, I think is one of the most effective advocacy things we can do together as a community to try to really change some of the real negative things that are happening in DC and impacting our communities right now. Thanks for your efforts, Valerie. Thanks for pulling this together. Mark, it's always a pleasure chatting with you. You're one of the most brilliant minds I've ever had the pleasure to work with. And Danny Davis is the greatest of all great Americans. So let's go on.
Yes. And I'm sorry we didn't have time to go through every question in chat, but we will review them and I'll share them with the panelists, and to the extent that we can, I'll be reporting out soon. You guys take care. Good night.